in mind, you know, if you're saying anything, we do share these on the internet on our website. So, you know, just bear that in mind. And if you obviously don't want to be in view, or you just want to ask a question but not have your name mentioned, then that's fine. We can do that. We will put the slides and the recording up on our website next week, once we've had a chance to upload those. Okay, so I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. Right, so just in terms of today, what we're going to be covering, what I forgot to do was introduce myself. So I'm Becky Moberly. I work for PAS, the Planning Advisory Service, and I'm leading a project funded by DEFRA, getting local authorities ready for biodiversity net gain when it becomes mandatory, which is expected to be next November. So we're going to do a bit of an intro, and then Krista, who is my colleague, who's also working for PAS, but is on secondment from Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and I'm going to go with a little intro to the topic. And then we've got folk from DEFRA and Natural England giving a bit of an update. So we've got Catherine Duggan from DEFRA and Nick White from Natural England giving a bit of an update from their perspective. Then coming back to me for a little bit, just to give a bit of an overview of Councillor McCusker from Salford City Council, giving a bit of overview of what they're doing in Salford around biodiversity net gain, and Councillor Alvey from Cornwall Council talking about the local nature recovery strategy and biodiversity net gain in Cornwall. So obviously great to have them. And then we'll have hopefully plenty of time for questions and answers, and then a bit of summing up, and we will definitely finish by 6:30 because I will need my dinner and I get hangry if I don't have my dinner on time. So, okay, so brilliant. Right, just a quick introduction to the Planning Advisory Service. We're part of the local government family, so we sit within the Local Government Association. There's a team of 14 of us. We're mainly funded by the Department for Levelling Up to support English planning authorities. We've got quite a wide programme of work. That is both about the sort of existing planning system, also changes that are coming up. So we're expecting, for example, some changes coming through the Levelling Up bill. We're assuming now that Gove's back in the Department for Levelling Up that will come back online, but we'll see. All change at the moment. So we've got work on design codes, developer contributions. We always do stuff on local plans and development management designation. Recently, we've started doing more stuff on environmental planning. So there's the project that I do on biodiversity net gain, which Gareth Brough, who's my colleague, who's also in the room, supports on, which is funded by DEFRA. We've got a couple of people who work on nutrient neutrality, of which Rachel Jones, who's in the room, is one. And then we've also got Krista here, who covers nature recovery, which is funded by Natural England. So just going to do a quick poll because we're just interested to know if you've been to a PAS event before, and one on biodiversity net gain. It's really great if you can answer these polls just because it allows us to kind of evaluate how we're doing and also just try and meet your needs a bit more. And as I said, apologies if you can't see that because they don't always work, unfortunately, for everybody if you haven't got full functionality. So we'll just leave that up for a second. Okay. So Krista and myself are just going to give a bit of an intro to the topic. So hand over to Krista.
Thanks, Becky. And so I'm just going to give a quick overview really in terms of the kind of wider nature recovery part of this and a bit of a background really in terms of why nature and why nature recovery matters. So key thing here really is natural environment plays, you know, an essential part of our lives. There are a number of benefits it provides on the wheel on the left, and obviously these, you know, these benefits can be valued, and we understand them much better now through natural capital accounting, but often that value isn't fully embedded within local decision making. But obviously there's a key role for nature and nature recovery to address, you know, the biggest challenge that we face: biodiversity loss, climate change and well-being. And if we don't protect, maintain and enhance our natural environment, then there's a cost to society. Next slide, please. So despite all these benefits, obviously the natural environment faces urgent and significant changes. And that's highlighted by some, you know, key reports like the State of Nature report, the recent HM Treasury that's good to review. But obviously, if we're tackling biodiversity emergency, we help to recover and at the same time secure the health and economic benefits for people, place and our economy. We've just lost our slides, but I'll carry on. There we go. We've come back to the policy context and background. So in order to kind of address these and reverse this decline and actually improve the environment within a generation and provide high quality accessible natural spaces, we have a raft of policy, including the 25-year Environment Plan and more recently the Environment Act. And one of the key things that I'm working on in terms of my project around nature recovery is around the ambition within the 25-year Environment Plan to develop a national nature recovery network. And I'll come on to a bit more on that in a minute. Next slide, please, Becky. So the Environment Act 2021 introduces a number of new duties for local authorities. And the next slide kind of just covers these, but effectively that's around biodiversity net gain, enhancing, so public, there's a duty in terms of public bodies to enhance biodiversity and report on their actions, for local authorities to comply with these duties and have regard to local nature recovery strategy. And again, we'll hear more about local nature recovery strategies a bit later on, and responsible authorities to lead on those local nature recovery strategies. So arrangements are being put in place at the moment to start bringing forward those and particularly to identify those responsible authorities, which are mainly at a county kind of level. So county councils, combined authorities and some unitaries have been identified as those responsible authorities. Next slide, Becky. And just to kind of provide a bit of a kind of introduction really in terms of, you know, what does this mean in terms of biodiversity net gain? So in terms of biodiversity net gain is an approach effectively that leaves development and the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was beforehand. And nature recovery, the difference between that, nature recovery is about the stepping beyond conservation into active restoration of the natural world, and that's about creating better, more joined up wildlife rich places that recover species and restore ecosystem services, and that we've got a more functioning natural environment to provide benefits for us and nature as well. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, the 25-year Environment Plan introduces the Nature Recovery Network and the ambition for that across the country. And there are a number of key elements as part of that. So one of those is around introducing, so there's kind of a number of key roles in terms of that kind of, it's the biggest single nature restoration project in our nation's history. It's a national network of wildlife rich places, and it's focusing not only on, you know, kind of large rural areas and connecting those, but also it's going from doorstep out to mountains. So every place has a role to play in terms of delivering on the National Nature Recovery Network, no matter how small it is, nature on your doorstep through to large scale restoration. So that's that. And in terms of how that Nature Recovery Network will be delivered, that provides the umbrella for a lot of the things that we're discussing today. Becky, next slide. So as I mentioned before, new spatial tools to target action and look at actually where we should be focusing that investment in nature, particularly through those local nature recovery strategies, but also an emphasis on strong partnerships to deliver action on the ground, engaging a range of key stakeholders, including landowners, businesses, local communities, conservation and organisation, local authorities, and many more. But also, lastly, about integration of policies and funding streams. So that's about how do we bring together existing funding streams with new funding streams like biodiversity net gain, new farming incentives to actually bring together public and private funding to deliver more for nature. Next slide. And I think that's it from me, Becky. I think it's over to you on the biodiversity net gain specific slides, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Krista.
No problem.
And just to say, we were aware there's lots of info in these slides, so we are sharing them afterwards. There's always too much to say about this topic, so you know, we want to say as much as we can, but we realise sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming, and we know there's probably quite a mix in terms of the audience, in terms of your knowledge. So please do come back to these afterwards. We'll have them on our website. I just really wanted to flag, I won't go into all the things on the right hand side here, but just to say that the National Planning Policy Framework does encourage net gain now. And I think Catherine from DEFRA is going to cover that a little bit more in a minute, but there are quite a lot of things out there already around net gain before we get into it becoming mandatory. So there is, you know, there's the NPPF, and there's also planning practice guidance specifically on the natural environment that refers to biodiversity net gain. It's got some really useful stuff. There's the biodiversity metric, which is a way to measure biodiversity net gain, and there's a couple of really good resources there, the good practice principles and the British standards. So those things are all available now in terms of, you know, how we do this, and places are already doing it. So you know, what we're really encouraging people is to think about what you might want to start doing now, even though it's not mandatory yet in terms of biodiversity net gain. And then I just also wanted to highlight that biodiversity net gain sits alongside and sort of on top of a lot of other biodiversity considerations through the planning systems. So these are already in place, and biodiversity net gain in no way replaces them. They stay in place. So there's all sorts of things like special sites for wildlife. They can be European sites protected by the habitats regulations, and sites of special scientific interest, protected species. There are the requirements under the habitats regulations for habitats regulations assessment, also strategic environmental assessment and environmental impact assessment, and the need to do surveys for all of these things. So all of those remain, and biodiversity net gain is an additional need. On the right there, I've just got outlined the mitigation hierarchy, which is a kind of key thing that, again, is already in policy. It's already in the national planning policy framework, but it's really key in terms of thinking about biodiversity net gain. And that sets out that you should avoid impacts first, and you do that by selecting a good site, looking at site layout and design. Then only once you've got to the stage where you've got impacts that are completely unavoidable do you think about mitigation. And then the last resort is to compensate for the impacts, rather than moving on to compensation as a last resort. And that's obviously a big thing for biodiversity net gain, where there are sort of concerns raised by some around, well, does that mean we default straight to compensation? Definitely not. You know, we've got to go through this hierarchy, and compensation only comes in at the last, as a last resort. So we're expecting, biodiversity net gain is enabled through the Environment Act, but there's secondary legislation that needs to come in to actually make it happen. And we're expecting that to happen in a year's time, in November next year. But we do know quite a lot about how it's going to work just from the Environment Act. We know that it will amend the Town and Country Planning Act, that a minimum of 10% gain will be required, calculated using the biodiversity metric, and that there will have to be approval by the local planning authority of a net gain plan. Habitat delivering biodiversity net gain will need to be secured for at least 30 years, and that will be via planning obligations or conservation covenants on site, maybe by conditions. It can be delivered, so habitat can be delivered on site or off-site, and also there's a new statutory biodiversity credit scheme being run nationally, again as a last resort if there can't be biodiversity units found locally. There's going to be a national register for the delivery net gain delivery sites to keep track of those. And as I said already, it doesn't change any of existing legal protections for important habitats and species, and maintains that mitigation hierarchy. It will apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects, NSIPs, but at the moment not to marine development, but there has been a recent consultation on that. Okay, so I'm going to pass to Catherine Duggan in the first instance, who's from the Biodiversity Net Gain team in DEFRA, and then Nick White, who's the Principal Advisor for Biodiversity Net Gain for Natural England, will follow Catherine. So I'll just flip over onto your slides, Catherine.
Thank you, Becky. I think it's now, I need to update that because it says October and we're now into November.
We've suddenly flipped
over, yeah, into November. So as Becky's already mentioned, I'm just going to very much focus on the kind of like legislative and context, and give a little bit of an update about mandatory biodiversity net gain and recent government consultations, and what DEFRA has been looking at, and what's coming up from a DEFRA perspective. As Becky says, the biodiversity net gain is been in the planning system. It was in the National Planning Policy Framework from 2012. It was strengthened as a policy in the review of the NPPF in 2018. And as part of the policy framework, that includes providing net gains for biodiversity and securing measurable net gains for biodiversity. So it's already in the planning system currently. Becky, if you want to flip on to the next slide, if it will catch up, because I think it's got a bit of a lag. The government consulted back in 2019 on a policy for making biodiversity net gain mandatory in the planning system, which then led to government committing to make B&G mandatory through the Environment Act, and the Environment Act achieved royal assent back in November 21, as Becky said. The Environment Act includes a number of clauses to apply a minimum of 10% increase in biodiversity to most planning applications. The government has proposed some exemptions to that, including sort of household development and permitted development. And there was a recent consultation back in January where there were some further exemptions that were also consulted on as well. The government announced back in 2019 that there would be a transition period. So that would be 2 years following royal assent of the Act prior to implementation. So as Becky said, the transition period was then running from November 2021. We expect that to run through to November 2023, when B&G would then become mandatory. The government, as I said, consulted earlier this year on a number of the bits of detail of how mandatory biodiversity net gain would work, and including some of the aspects of more detail in secondary legislation. It included questions on sort of how to apply biodiversity net gain to development exemptions, detail on the operation of some of the aspects that Becky has mentioned, like the register and how sort of, the offsite market for biodiversity units would work. It also included some consultation on applying mandatory biodiversity net gain to nationally significant infrastructure projects, but it's worth being clear that that's sort of on a longer timescale. So the government's proposed to apply those from 2025. The government has also consulted recently on the biodiversity metric for use for mandatory biodiversity net gain. So as a number of people have mentioned, application of mandatory biodiversity net gain is underpinned by a metric, which determines sort of your biodiversity units that you would need to have. And there was a consultation on that over the summer, and we're considering the outcome of that consultation at the moment. And as Becky's also said, there's been a separate consultation on the principles of applying biodiversity net gain to the marine environment as well. So what I'm talking about is predominantly in the terrestrial context. Next slide, please, Becky. When it comes up, I'll just go through a couple of things of what we've been looking at in terms of DEFRA. So during the transition period, DEFRA and others have been working on several areas. This includes, as I mentioned, the secondary legislation, so setting out some of the detail, publication of that biodiversity metric that will underpin a mandatory system, developing some of the systems that will be required to support mandatory biodiversity net gain. So as a couple of people mentioned, handling the sale of national statutory biodiversity credits as a last resort where these are not available locally, and also managing that national register of any off-site mitigation units that are used within the mandatory system. There's also work on skills and capacity. So this particular project that is being funded, that PAS are carrying out, and development, quite a lot of focus at the moment on the development of guidance, tools and support for implementing biodiversity net gain. So this includes things like standardised templates for how to capture and record biodiversity net gain information through the process. And there's also some work looking at monitoring, evaluation and assurance, so making sure that net gain is additional biodiversity on top of other existing requirements, and that's working overall. Next slide, please, Becky. So again, when it comes up, just a little bit on capacity and skills. So some of the work that DEFRA has been looking at is looking at understanding the requirements for capacity and skills, because it will be a new system. So we carried out some work and a survey last year through Algae and Adept on surveying local planning authorities on sort of the capacity and skills requirement. That is published on DEFRA Science Search. That's the project code there. It's not the most user-friendly to look at, but if you search by that project code, you should be able to find it there if you would like to have a look at that. The government distributed £4.18 million this year as part of preparation funding for biodiversity net gain, and that process is continuing in terms of looking at what the new burdens would be in terms of additional burdens on local authorities during the transition period and from November 23 onwards. There's also obviously this project running funded through PAS, and as I said, we're also working on looking at guidance as well. Next slide. And so and what's next, I think, in short, writing and testing guidance, publication of consultation responses, and obviously the statutory instruments I mentioned. Also doing a lot of engagement through these events and other events as well with particular sectors, including people like land managers and developers, as well as obviously local authorities will be key to implementation of biodiversity again. Some work on digital, so the creation of these new systems to support mandatory biodiversity net gain, and as I've mentioned, focusing on the new burdens process as well. So I think that's me, Becky.
Lovely, thanks Nick. Okay, I'll just go on to the next, sorry, thanks Catherine. I was going to say I would like to introduce Nick White from Natural England, but I got my names muddled up. Nick.
Thanks, Becky, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, so as Becky said, it's great to see a number of local authorities already implementing that gain through the local plan, and that's possible through the National Planning Policy Framework. But there is this mandatory approach coming, which we know is going to be commencing hopefully in November next year. So there's things, though, that local authorities can begin to be doing now or be implementing now to get ready for that, even if you've not got an existing kind of plan requirement. So the first thing is, both at an authority level and also in engagement with developers, is be thinking about net gain early. The earlier that developers are considering it in terms of their site selection, their outline design, the easier they'll find to deliver net gain. And equally, the earlier authorities are thinking about how to deliver and implement net gain locally, the easier you'll find it to be when it comes through next year. There is existing guidance and best practice standards out there. So there's guidance produced by professional bodies, SAIM, Syria and IEMA. There's a British standard now on biodiversity net gain, and there will be good practice guidance and advice coming through from government as well. One of the key things to start thinking about are what are the kind of your local priorities for nature. So Krista was talking about local nature recovery strategies, and obviously these are coming through, and they'll be there to kind of help to map and identify where people would like to see habitats invested in for new habitats, existing habitats enhanced. Also, kind of what do you want to see delivered more of locally, in terms of it might be new hedgerows or kind of as a short grassland. The more clearly you can set out what these local priorities are, the easier it will be for net gain to start to deliver those as well. There's mechanisms in the metric that allow you to do that. So do start to think about what your local priorities for nature are. And that could be as well through just highlighting existing strategies as an interim measure, green infrastructure strategies and the like. Familiarise yourselves with the metric. So particularly if you're doing kind of looking at calls for sites and things like that, looking at factoring in kind of metric calculations into those. How easy is it going to be for developers to deliver net gain on those sites? Be thinking too as well about how you're expecting to see net gain delivered. So the national approach will ask for developers to deliver net gain on site in the first instance, and then if they can't do that, consider delivery off site. And any deviation from that, you'd need to set out in your local plan. The scope as well to be looking at where you've got your own, as authorities, your land owners, and appreciate not all are, but there could be scope to deliver net gain on your own lands as well. That could be through enhancing the nature quality of existing parks and green spaces, kind of local authority owned farms, and that could be a good way of encouraging and generating investment into those spaces as well. And then also, and to conclude, net gain isn't just something that's of interest or concern to planning departments or kind of ecologists where you've got ones. It's also something that will have an impact in terms of the operation of the finance department, legal teams, etc., all coming to grips with how this new approach will work. And so it's fantastic to see so many of you on the call today. It'll be great if authorities can begin to identify kind of local champions for net gain where they don't currently exist, who can act as an advocate for the approach across the authority. But that's it for me, Becky. So back to you, I think.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. And please do put questions in the Q&A box. Okay, we're collecting a few already, which is great. So just to expand a little bit more on what Nick and Catherine and Krista and myself have already said. Just as Krista, as we've said already, this obviously, in terms of your role as a local authority, this is really key in terms of making planning decisions, but also thinking about your local plan policies and what you want to do in a place to deliver for nature, but also deliver for people. Now, I think one of the things that, we'll be hearing very soon from councillors from Salford and from Cornwall around what they're doing. But one of the things we're really hearing strongly through from councils we talk to who are sort of taking this forward at an early stage is thinking about how this links into overarching council strategy and objectives. So it's not necessarily just about biodiversity. That is obviously important, but it's thinking about those local nature recovery strategies, as you said. Has the council declared a climate emergency? The biodiversity and climate emergencies are inextricably linked. So actually doing things about biodiversity can help address the climate emergency. How does it link into placemaking and infrastructure? What are your aspirations around that? And also wider natural capital ecosystem services. So I know we had a question from Giles Archibald in the chat around this. We've got biodiversity loss, but what about all the other wider things beyond habitats and carbon footprint and water pollution? Well, the metric itself doesn't measure those, but there are tools being developed that do go into that, and actually delivering for the natural environment does deliver for those things as well, and can be really positive, particularly around things like sort of health benefits. As Nick already said, it's thinking about how you join up across council services, including estates, and it can act actually as a sort of really good source of funding for the local authority in terms of biodiversity net gain. What mapping, evidence and data might you want? What you might want to be thinking there? Working in partnership, and that's both with other local authorities within your area, but also with local non-government organisations like the Wildlife Trust, for example. If you've got a local nature partnership, they'll be very interested in this approach and often being pretty proactive around that. Thinking about how you can secure funding and deliver nature recovery on the ground, as well as a key role for local authorities is going to be around engaging with those local communities and farmers and landowners to get this up the agenda and get it working. So, and in terms of biodiversity net gain, it doesn't become mandatory for a year, but I think, again, we'd really encourage people to start thinking about starting now, as Nick already said. And one of the things is that you can test approaches and feed in your experience to Natural England and DEFRA before it becomes mandatory and before we've got a lot of rules around it. I think a lot of this I've covered already, but it's just really around, there are other reasons to do this beyond just the fact that it's going to become legally required. And some of these take time to think about and take time to start going. But I think, one of the things we're hearing quite strongly is it's really useful to test these things now. And the last one is just, there's been some concerns raised around, you know, what happens when it becomes mandatory? What happens in October 2023? Do we suddenly get a rush of really rubbish planning applications that have no biodiversity net gain? So the earlier you start, the better. But it is worth bearing in mind, you need to think about, you know, the fact that you can't rely on the Environment Act now. So you'll need to think about what's in the National Planning Policy Framework and your local plan policy, which may not, so the National Planning Policy Framework, for example, doesn't set a percentage for biodiversity net gain. So, and depending on what your local plan says, if that doesn't set a percentage, you may not get up to the 10%. You may only be able to secure, say, for example, 1%, but that's still worth having a go at now. Okay, so yeah, just some thoughts. I won't go into the detail on this slide, but just to say, we've got a lot of tools on our website, and we're really thinking about biodiversity net gain and delivering it as a journey, and the various elements of that and what you need to think about, including local plans and strategic planning and establishing development management arrangements, also these things around corporate embedding and placemaking principles, local strategy and evidence, and then how you get on to delivery of schemes and monitoring reporting. Now, in terms of what's actually going to be legally required when it becomes mandatory, really just that sort of pink diagram up there with the little boxes on it, all as a legal minimum, you just need to be ready to receive and determine planning applications and check whether they meet 10% biodiversity net gain and that they can achieve that over a 30-year timescale. And I say just, but that's a big thing in itself. But actually, to secure some of these really wider links, you can start thinking about how it links into green and blue infrastructure, as we've said already, nature recovery strategies, work with partners, and how it links into your local plan to really deliver those wider benefits. And we've got councillors talking now about how they've done that. And just in terms of what we're doing to help, we've got a lot of web-based information. We've got frequently asked questions. We've got information around that journey and nature recovery. We're collating case studies. We've got examples of best practice where we hear about those. We put slides and recordings from our events on our website. We've got some from some events we ran back in June on conservation covenants, if you're interested in those, which are new legal agreements that come in through the Environment Act. We're running these events. We've also got a lot of events running for officers. We tend to do fewer for councillors, I'm afraid, but we will be looking at how we can engage better with councillors going forward. We also have an officer practitioner network, and we do stakeholder liaison, and we feed back into DEFRA. So we feed what we hear from you guys back to DEFRA. Obviously, we've got DEFRA and Natural England in the room today, and also to Department of Levelling Up to say what we're hearing, what the issues are for you, but also how you're doing things in terms of policy development. Okay, we've just got a couple of polls. I'm hoping that most of you can see these, so we're just going to launch them. And it's just really to find out a bit more, because we're not going to be able to hear from everybody in the room, just what you think about nature recovery and how, firstly, how big an opportunity you think that might be for improving your place, but also how well prepared your local authority is at the moment for delivering nature recovery. So those hopefully should pop up. If you can't see them right on your screen, so for me they come right up on my screen, they may appear in the chat. I'm afraid if you can't see them at all, we know that some people do have a bit of trouble with if you haven't got the sort of full version of Teams down there, so you can always post in the chat. I see someone's already done that, which is great, your answer, or let us know afterwards. Okay, I'll just leave those running. I'm just going to click over as those go. So we're getting some answers into those, which is great. And we've just got a few on biodiversity net gain as well. So I'll just click through to those as people answer them. So again, we ran an event for councillors back in last June, and we asked some questions then, and we're really interested to know whether things have moved on since then and how things are going. Obviously, we've got a different audience, so it's not completely comparable. But for us, it's really useful to hear this, not only so that we can help you with the wider project, but also so we can work out you know, where the gaps are, and also how evaluating our project and seeing if it's working. So we firstly like to ask, has your authority started working on biodiversity net gain? And that could be anything. It could be determining planning applications, it could be thinking about policy, it could be looking at off-site delivery. And also, do you understand your role as a councillor? And obviously there's quite a specific role as a councillor. If you sit on a planning committee, that might be a bit different to if you don't, but yeah, there's obviously a role there. And how confident do you feel that your local authority can be ready to deliver biodiversity net gain when it becomes mandatory, which is currently expected to be in a year's time? So it'd be great if you can answer those. Sorry to flash them all up at once, they're probably overwhelming you slightly. But it's really useful for us to gauge a bit more from the audience to see what you're doing. Okay, so we will leave those running. Just double check with, I think we're all good. And I'd like to introduce Councillor Mike McCusker, who's from Salford City Council, and he's going to talk a bit about what they've been doing in Salford.
Okay, thanks very much. And do you want to move to the first slide? Yeah, hi, I'm Councillor Mike McCusker. I'm lead member for Planning, Transport and Sustainable Development at Salford City Council. And next slide, please. Yeah, I just want to talk about what we've been doing here in Salford. Salford's city in the northwest of England and sits in one of the 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester, fastest growing city in the country. Between the two censuses, we've grown by 15.4% and added an extra 33,000 people in that period. So I'm just going to go through the Greater Manchester context, how we've been developing our local plan policy, the fact that we've managed to be at a stage where we'll be able to implement ahead of the national timeline, and then talk about some issues and challenges that we've faced. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I think we've got a bit of a delay on the slides. I have clicked through. I don't know why it's delayed. Apologies.
Is that the second slide? Yeah, so the Greater Manchester context. So we've got a strong local nature partnership. It's called the Greater Manchester Natural Capital Group. We benefited from 2016 pilot that DEFRA ran. We became the Urban Pioneer Project, which was basically to see how, in the local context, we could support and inform the development of the implementation of the government's 25-year environmental plan. So through that, it helped us to bring together research, policy development and interventions to deliver change that could be replicated in other local authorities. It was initially unfunded, but we managed to squeeze some money out of the Environment Agency. Thanks very much for a small core team to help deliver the project. And then beyond the core team, we had a delivery group comprising officers and representatives from a range of organisations to deliver it. So key things for us that came out of that was being able to establish robust governance, common thematic language, multi-stakeholder ownership and collaboration, and a strong project team. So that helped early days in helping us apply natural capital approaches to decision making, developing funding opportunities. So we've created the Greater Manchester Environment Fund based from that work. We've demonstrated integrated approaches to planning and delivery and sourced solutions, finding out what works best. So from that, we had the Biodiversity Net Gain Task Force established, which was set about, as the earlier speaker said, mapping Greater Manchester's habitats and sites that were ready to be improved, and the existing areas that we had. It helped us understand the potential for improvement, looking at different parts of Greater Manchester's natural environment, geography and ecology. It set out what we wanted to achieve and how we would achieve that, and helped us to prioritise and map. So we're clear on the priorities we want to achieve through management, improvement, creation or expansion of habitats, and where the best potential locations would take place. We got consultancy support from various organisations and created a guidance document that could be applied across the region. And we had early engagement, of course, with all the 10 councils, development management and policies planners. Okay, next slide, please. So all this has helped raise awareness and help train officers and councillors across Greater Manchester. So we ran seminars and workshops for planners and politicians. We've worked through, so officers were able to work through the DEFRA biodiversity net gain metric and helped to inform the various different changes that have taken to that as it's been developed. And initially we had training for 5 planners from each district that helped in development, management and policy planning. Thank you. This is like when you've got a foreign correspondent across the world somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know why there's such a delay. It's really annoying, and it worries me because I was talking to my slides, and obviously, anyway, hopefully that you can see that now.
Yeah, no, that's fine, thanks. So yeah, so we developed a 5-year environmental plan which sets out our long-term environmental vision. We aim to be carbon neutral by 2038 and sets out the urgent actions that we'll need to take over the next 4 years to achieve it. So key parts of the vision are our infrastructure will be smart and fit for the future. All citizens will have access to green space in every community, and citizens and business will adopt sustainable living and business practices. So within that, the natural environment, we aim to protect, maintain and enhance our natural environment for benefit for everyone, and taking steps to implement and achieve environmental net gain. Within the city, ourselves, we declared a climate emergency in 2019 and last month declared a biodiversity emergency. And we have strong local leadership. We've got an elected city mayor, and clearly the mayor and myself as lead member are really dedicated to this and trying to push it forward. So Salford, yeah, Salford's infamous in the song Dirty Old Town by Ewan MacColl. So not the dirty old town that he described. Approximately half the city area is open land. We've got parks, farmlands, and we've managed to create green spaces on former industrial sites as well. So 30% of the city's green belt. In our new local plan, which is through examination in public, we're actually going to have a net increase in green belt through the redefining the green belt areas. We've got high levels of deprivation in some areas and high levels of inequality within the city. As I said before, we've grown by 33,000 people in the last 10 years. Much of that development taking place within the regional centre where we sit over the river from Manchester and at Media City and the former quays. Next. Okay, so within the context, then only 20% of local sites are in positive conservation management. We've got no water bodies at good or good ecological status, although recently we did have an otter reappear on the river at Irwell for the first time in God knows how long. We've got green belt, which I'll show in the map in the next slide. In West Salford, it's part of a narrow gap between Greater Manchester and Merseyside. That's not it. And we've got no nationally or internationally designated sites for nature conservation. So next slide, please. Okay, if you could just move your pointer over where it says Salford Quays. So on that stretch there on the eastern side is where much of the development has taken place. High density flats, tower blocks. On the west of the city, we've got Chat Moss, an area of mossland, and that hashed area in green is what we're calling the core area. And very much one of the things we want to get out of biodiversity net gain is the re-wetting of as much of the moss as we can. A lot of the mossland area, because of what takes place in there in terms of agriculture, it's actually a net contributor to our carbon footprint. So we're trying to make sure that, sorry, you can move on. We're trying to make sure that becomes the carbon sequestration area that we know it can be if we can bring it back to its former glory. So moving on again. And it moved very quickly before. So yeah, so we're in the fortunate position of being at the stage of developing our local plan as the environment bill's moving through Parliament. So we split our plan into two. Much of the allocations will sit within a Greater Manchester wide spatial framework called Places for Everyone, but we felt it important in order to protect our environment, that as that was taking a long time to come through, that we would bring forward our development management policies and designations in what we're calling a local plan part 1. So linking to the key theme of the Mayor's priorities about aiming to create a better and fairer Salford for all, trying to address those issues of inequality is central to everything that we're doing in the plan. We'll ensure that when development takes place, it's genuinely sustainable. So we're looking at supporting economic, social and environmental objectives and looking for social value in everything that we do, and sets out our strategic objectives for the city over the longer term. Slide, please. So within that sits our biodiversity net gain policy. So as the previous speakers were saying, under the National Policy Planning Framework, there has to be net gain, but it doesn't set it out, although the new Environment Act, when it comes into place, will set that out. But within our local plan, which is gaining more and more how much we can rely on it in our planning decisions, we're expecting it to, we're now just waiting for the final inspector's report to come back so we can then put it to full council. We were hoping for November, but we might have to, that might slip unless we get it very, very soon. However, it says that all development will have net gain, and major developments shall deliver at least 10% net gain. So again, ahead of the legislation, and we're already starting to implement that now. Next slide, please. Okay, so challenges to policy. So some challenges to the 10% we have received when the publication was at an early stage. And we also had challenges on the other side from an environmental perspective, saying we're not going far enough. So the background note on biodiversity net gain prior to submission, there was far less challenge. As we went further and further through, we're seeing less and less challenge from developers. Next, I think it's my last slide. Yeah, so as I said, we're ahead of the regulations. So we've introduced validation checklists. So developers on larger developments have to use the biodiversity net gain metric before an application will be validated. In our development management policies, currently based on the MPPF, but as soon as the policy is published, we'll be at 10%. So that should be early in the new year. We've had ongoing work at Greater Manchester level, looking at pricing biodiversity units, sharing good practice. We started compiling a list of potential off-sites, currently commissioning habitat management plans for 3 city-owned sites within Salford. And as I said before, we declared a biodiversity emergency in October. I think now this is my last slide.
taking a while this time. It's still not come up.
No.
Mm.
I think we were looking at issues on the last slide, anyway. Oh,
Yeah, it's come up for me, so
Yeah,
I don't
it's
know
there
why
now.
it's not. Yeah, it's good. Okay.
Yeah, so obviously issues and challenges, understanding and adherence to new requirement varies. So for instance, I'm not going to name and shame any developers in Salford, but some issues that we've come across is around habitats which are present on the habitat survey are being absent for the metric because the consultant doing the BNG report assumed that all of the grass was astroturf, so it had no value. That's a real example. Trees which were present on the boundary of a site excluded from the baseline calculation, but then included in the post-development calculation and therefore claimed as net gain despite being present on site at the start. And we've had reports which claim biodiversity net gain by talking in general terms without providing any baseline or metric information. Now that happened early on and we haven't seen that happening recently. Yeah, so under our local plan, we don't require metric for minor development, but we were receiving similar approaches on minor developments in some case. So obviously, key issues for us about offset sites, you know, where most of the developments taken place within the heart of the regional centre, and that's mainly been on former car parks. So obviously not a great deal of biodiversity net gain to offset there. But clearly we want the benefit to be as close to the development as possible. And then, so obviously it's what's important to us given the biodiversity crisis, that it's not just open space or recreation space, that you know there is demonstrable biodiversity gain. Key issues about who's going to do that 30-year management plan, management of those sites, and the role of the nature recovery strategies in guiding investment, and how do we link that to planning. It's a new work area that needs to be resourced. I don't think there's that many local authorities, given the cutbacks, that have you know, ecology officers in place. We pool it in Greater Manchester across the Greater Manchester Environmental Unit in order to get that expertise. But clearly, it's going to be a growing area for all local authorities, and will need to be further resourced. And you know, can we get upfront funding in order to be able to be in a position to hit the ground running, as the former Prime Minister would say, hit the ground. Yeah, so further funding still required to address the declining biodiversity area on top of what we're going to generate through net gain. And that's me.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Councillor. So we're going to leave questions until after Councillor Martin Alvey's spoken from Cornwall Council. So I'd like to welcome him. So he's going to share his own slides. So hopefully we won't have the farce that we had with me clicking on and it taking ages. So please do put your questions in the chat for both councillors, and we've got lots already come in, so that's brilliant. So sorry, put those in the question and answer section if you can. And you'll see there's some answers coming in. So I'd like to welcome Councillor Martin Alvey from Cornwall Council. Thank you.
Hello, Becky. Hopefully, well, we're not going to have a whole new level of pain with me sharing the slides. It
seems to be okay so far. So
it seems to be okay so far. That's good. You can just see the main slide rather than the presentation bit as well, which hopefully will mean that things will happen properly. First slide you've got there, just introducing me. I'm Martin Alvey. I'm the portfolio holder for environment and climate change at Cornwall Council. I'm going to now talk through where Cornwall Council is going on this, and hopefully I've pressed the button and it's moved to the next slide. If it has, please let me know, and we'll be up and running.
All good, yeah.
All
much
good.
better
That's
than
great.
me. I'll get you to
That's
do the whole
great.
thing next time, Martin.
Just For a bit of context, Cornwall Council declared a climate emergency back in January 2019 and a ecological emergency in November last year. And with our climate emergency, we set on a three-pillar approach to how we were going to tackle it. Clearly, climate change leading to net zero was the first pillar, ecological emergency the second, and adaptation the third. And today we're going to be focusing on the ecological emergency and how that feeds into biodiversity net gain. A little bit of context around nature in Cornwall, which everyone thinks of as a green and wonderful place. But actually, we've also got some major designations here, AONB, SSSI, as well as our own local county wildlife sites. The slides today are rather busy, but I know they're going to be shared. But that just gives you some idea of the actual land in Cornwall and how, for example, almost 75% of it is set aside for agriculture. But that doesn't mean that everything is rosy in the garden, and our state of nature is actually, rather poor. So, for example, this shows that Cornwall reflects the downward trends that we're seeing nationally and globally, with over half of our most important species in long-term decline, and many local extinctions already taking place. Many other species are now at risk, and this is one of the reasons. One of the reasons for this is clear, and the key KPIs that we use actually track some of the key determinants of our ecosystem's health locally. So, whilst the evidence is gloomy, we also know that we can bend the curve on species loss across Cornwall through nature recovery. And as such, we've already adopted a long-term strategy, which actually was adopted back in 2016 for nature through to 2065. It sets key milestones, a target that 30% of our land and seas will be well managed for nature by 2030. And that's up from around the 20% that we're presently at. Getting there will be a major task, but things like the local nature recovery strategy and biodiversity net gain will all be crucial in helping us to get there. So now we've begun to embed nature recovery into other plans across the council, like our climate emergency development planning document, which is actually currently with the planning inspector for examination, will hopefully be coming online formally as a policy document early next year, although it already carries some weight in the planning process. We've also adopted the use of a decision-making wheel in terms of all our decisions across the council, particularly focusing on climate and environment, using the Cape Raworth donut economics model. And this has been showcased in various other meetings and is recognised actually now as being some best practice in decision making around climate and biodiversity. So some of the initiatives that we're currently taking on, and some examples of delivery of our programmes. Forests of Cornwall, we're aiming to get 8,000 hectares of trees locally. We're taking action for urban biodiversity through a project known as Making Space for Nature. That's turning urban green spaces into areas that are well suited for nature. Peatland restoration, research programs, a land hub that we're developing, and of course throughout this we're working with business and communities. Some of the key partnerships in this, obviously we have our local nature recovery partnership, which is a very, very effective body. Our chair, Lord Teverson, has a very well connected network across the Duchy of Partners and beyond. He's a former member of the European Parliament, and as I say, currently a member of the House of Lords, where he focuses on nature and biodiversity. We've got members on the board that range from tourism through to industry, so it fully embeds the whole concept of nature recovery across the whole the whole network of organisations and businesses in Cornwall. We recently actually had a summit brought together at Heartlands, which is one of our heritage sites in Cornwall, and we've invited everybody, be they an organisation, an individual or a company, to make a pledge for nature, and those can actually be found through the local nature recovery website, and indeed you can see the scope of people that have actually made those pledges. Almost 200 pledges being made, and actually those pledges represent about 13,000 hectares of Cornwall. So moving on to Cornwall's draft local nature recovery strategy, and we were one of the 5 local authorities invited to produce a draft local nature recovery strategy. And of course, to do a strategy like this, we actually needed some baseline information. We were with Greater Manchester and others, as I say, one of the first to adopt a strategy, but the components of the strategy are the statement of the priorities, the written document outlining what we want to recover and how, and a map of where those priorities can best be delivered. And as mentioned, we also commissioned a baseline analysis from the Cornwall Wildlife Trust during the pilot that outlined the state of nature locally and actually the challenges that we face. So the strategy itself, as per the guidance, there are 10 incorporating principles that were actually we were encouraged to include, but Cornwall being different and recognising the fact that we're surrounded by water and the fact that the sea is inextricable from the land in terms of our nature, we've gone beyond the intertidal zone into our estuaries and our coastal waters. And so within our local nature strategy, we've recognised the marine environment as well as the shore-based environment. Otherwise, we feel we would have missed such an important and key element of the strategy. I mentioned earlier that our target is actually 30% of Cornwall well managed for nature, and that we are currently at around the 20% mark, 20.7% to be precise. So this journey to 2030 is going to require us initially to obviously continue to look after those sites that we've got, our SSSIs, our areas of outstanding natural beauty, not all of which the AONBs are actually currently being well managed for nature. But moving on, the next phase is to actually identify those quick wins. So getting the rest of our AONBs up to standard, and those areas that we can bring on stream fairly quickly. But actually to achieve that 30% target by 2030, we've actually got to recognise that every single piece of land in Cornwall may have the potential for biodiversity net gain and to be managed well for nature. So that final element of the strategy makes sure that we're taking advantage of every urban public open space, encouraging people to consider how they look after their gardens, those efforts within new developments to ensure that there are those wildlife corridors that are so important, everything as small as bee bricks in buildings. So it is about those opportunities which I mentioned with the earlier slide, supporting those key species, and just generally not missing a trick anywhere. And with this, working very closely with our town and parish councils to ensure that every opportunity is taken to actually deliver nature recovery, be it in an urban or rural setting. To develop the strategy, we first established, obviously, governance through the steering group, our AOMBs, and the local nature partnership. But it's worth noting that the ease of this for us may actually reflect the fact that we are, as a council, the secretariat for the LMP. But others may actually require more time to build up those relationships. So if you are getting started on your nature recovery strategy, you probably want to start thinking about building those relationships now if they don't already exist. And secondly, we drew up an engagement plan for that group to approve, outlining the aims and key audiences, the key work streams that the stakeholder group would need to engage with. We then launched a digital nature recovery engagement hub, hosting the surveys, videos of workshops, and providing contextual information on things like the baseline analysis. And we promoted this hub through the press, social media, and newsletters from ourselves and, of course, the LMP partners. Of course, we then undertook workshops, including our LMP conference for the general public, a workshop for farmers delivered within the Cornwall AOMB, and making other workshops with existing stakeholder groups. And this was all done during lockdown, so it was actually primarily a digital thing, which worked very well, enabling more democratic engagement and the much easier analysis by officers. And of course, being a very large rural county, it meant people didn't have to travel so far. So just to highlight that our surveying repeatedly finds real high levels of support for nature recovery, driven by strong views about its intrinsic value and its relevance for tackling climate change and flooding. And it's important to recognise that actually nature recovery for many people is something far more relatable than encouraging them to reduce their carbon footprint. So that Venn diagram between nature recovery and carbon neutrality is very, very strong. The ecological emergency has also perhaps less of a profile of the climate emergency, but owing to things like the profile of sewage pollution, enthusiasm for tree planting, and the locality and visibility of natural habitats, landscapes, and wildlife, among other things, it's likely to attract even stronger support and enthusiasm than the climate change action that I just mentioned. So 5 recommendations coming out of this is that to build partnerships politically, getting buy-in and the profile using evidence of the decline, use digital engagement as far as possible, make sure the local nature recovery strategy isn't just for ecologists. It's given a wide audience, make it visual, snappy and interactive. Manage conflict by giving options, don't be overly prescriptive, and use evidence, and don't try to resolve all the debates in the strategy on issues that need to happen at site level. Finally, wait for the guidance, but start building those relationships now and thinking about hooks into the wider strategies. Finally, I just want to go on and talk briefly about biodiversity net gain. So we introduced biodiversity net gain here in Cornwall for all major applications back in March 2020, requiring a net gain plan to detail how and where the net gain will be achieved. a non-statutory Chief Planning Officer note currently sets out the requirements based on interpretation of policies 23 and 28 of our local plan, and it followed collaboration between our planning and environment teams, who also produced a Planning for Biodiversity guide, which gives expanded guidance for developers. Our Climate Emergency Development Plan document, CEDPD, which is currently, as I said earlier, approaching the end of examination, further contains formal policy for the requirement for biodiversity net gain. As it's adopted early, the requirement is made within the limits of the existing planning system, and we can't create a statutory pre-commencement planning condition ourselves. That means applicants have to demonstrate their plans at validation stage of a planning application. A planning condition then sets out our expectations for monitoring and reporting a set of periods from commencement of the development. It hasn't advanced. There we go. We require the use of DEFRA's biodiversity metric, as shown in the slide here. The role of our county ecologist is then to check the submissions and assess their suitability, and then we benefited from the guidance forums and courses already available for that. So our approach embeds the mitigation hierarchy, prioritising avoidance and prevention of impacts above on or off-site off-site or on-site compensation, and we prefer on-site gain, clearly as described previously in Salford, as at least no net loss on our sites is just a minimum, but clearly it's not always possible to get that net gain on site. Given our ecologist's agreement, developers can though pursue that off-site delivery underpinned by a Section 106 agreement. We also prefer that off-site delivery is local to the development itself and at sites that are strategically significant for the local nature recovery strategy, both of which therefore feature within the metric. We also currently allow developers to make a financial contribution as a last resort for us to facilitate delivery akin to the government's proposed statutory credits, but that will end in November 2023 once the statutory credit system is in place. So our early adoption means that there are, of course, some differences in our current policies and the emerging national policy, such as the way that we implement those. So finally, then, just to note 3 strategic considerations that you may wish to consider over the next year. First, resourcing, and that at the first stage of reporting, it's required only at year 2. We do not have the developments. Sorry, I've moved my notes along too quickly there. We do not have the processes, and it's been relatively smooth. So how the processes have been relatively smooth so far. Evaluation is taking up a lot of our ecologists' capacity, and due to the large numbers of applications that we receive, this will soon increase the burden to evaluate and decide upon proposals and to monitor and enforce delivery. We welcome the promised provision of new burdens funding to support this, but you should be mindful of the potential resource implications for monitoring, plan evaluation or validation. There needs to be sufficient ecologist capacity in particular to achieve this. Secondly, we have seen relatively small demand for off-site delivery since March 2020, but it is anticipated there will be an increased demand for it over time, and it's unclear how much demand there will be through the market. The central estimate of DEFRA's impact assessment assumes a quarter of units will, whilst a recent study of the early adopters found only around 4.5% have done so far. I'll finish now because I appreciate that I've gone over time a little, so I'll just leave it open now to go back to the Q&A.
Lovely, thank you very much. That's brilliant. That's really, really useful to hear all of that. So I'm just zipping on, just to add in, we'll come back to the questions and answers. We've got some great questions in there, but just so just to say that we are running, we've obviously run this event for members, and we've got lots of stuff on our website. We're also running a lot of events for officers, and all of those are recorded. So even though they are targeted at officers, you can obviously access those and access the slides for those on our website. And we're doing ongoing support and really thinking actually about how we engage better with councillors through the project, because we've sort of engaged more with officers. Do look at our website and do sign up to the PAS bulletin for that will give you updates. So just to say there, once we get into the Q&A, I will share a couple of polls just to get some feedback from you around what you thought of today. So I'll do that shortly. But in terms of questions, I think actually I've got one straight away for Councillor Alvey. Just asking how big so you mentioned about the issues with the ecological resource. How big is your ecological team, Martin?
We have one county ecologist, although actually we have another person that we've recruited that will be starting soon. So the ecology team itself will be 2 people, but within my environmental growth team, there are also other specialists who have been involved in obviously the development of all our plans. But in terms of the county ecologist, 1+1 inbound.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I see that Helen Burnley's on the call today, so she's answered a couple of questions. So she is that person. Okay, so just I've got that thing. Do put your questions into questions and answers. We've already got a lot of those. If you can see the questions and answers, lots of those have already been answered, so I probably won't go over those. There was one in particular I just wanted to flag, which has been answered, but it's come up a couple of times, and it was people asking if you can go above the 10%, so the 10% is a minimum. And just to say that we know lots of councils that are looking to go above 10%, quite a lot of them are going for 20%. We don't know any local plans that have been adopted with 20%. I mean, there may be one out there that we're just not aware of, but we don't know of any. On our website, I did put in an answer to, I think it was Councillor Tuck's question, just a link to our website, because that has got some links in terms of the evidence for those that some local authorities have started doing. There's been a really excellent study by Kent County Council actually on that, which can be also repeated elsewhere. They've done it in a way that can be repeated around checking. It's really about viability and checking in. And what that found was actually the issue really in viability is getting to the 10%. The 20% doesn't make much of a difference, but do have a look at that. But I think the key thing is, as Nick said in answer to that question, once biodiversity net gains becomes mandatory, the 10% will be required. If you want to go above the 10%, you will need evidence to support that, because you'll get pushback otherwise. So just to be aware that you will need some evidence to demonstrate that that is achievable in your area. But hopefully over time we'll get more examples to share of that. Okay, so just a couple of questions I was going to flag. There was just looking at the ones I was going to, just a question about the, might come to Nick and Catherine about this one, about the biodiversity benchmark. So when is the biodiversity benchmark on a site set, is concerned about developer gaming? So I know there is a date set in terms of that. Nick, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so it's the baseline value of the site before any development works have commenced is what forms the kind of the initial calculation. We know there are instances where a developer deliberately tries to degrade a site, sadly, and this isn't necessarily going to always prevent that from happening, but there are mechanisms in place with B&G that help to strengthen the local authority's hand. So if you feel that a developer has deliberately degraded a site and what they've said is the baseline isn't truly reflective of the actual value, and if you can't reach an agreement with the developer on what is a more appropriate value, then the Environment Act enables you to say, actually, I don't agree with you. The baseline value is going to be the value the site was at, and it's a very specific date, the 30th of January 2020, which is the day the bill came into Parliament. So you can then use other data such as, aerial photography or Google Maps or something like that to say, actually, no, this is a more accurate reflection of what the baseline value was than you're saying. And the Act allows you to do that. So it does create this. If you've got a dispute, it is the date of the 30th of January 2020 that is the default one.
Brilliant, thanks, Nick. We also had a question about exemptions, specifically about listed building consents where there isn't any development per se, and just whether those are exempted. I think my understanding is if it's purely listed building consent, that wouldn't count. That doesn't come under TCPA anyway. But I don't know, Nick, if I see you've got your microphone off again. Did you want to come in?
So there was a government consultation earlier this year on some of the secondary legislation. One of those sort of set out potential areas of exemption. Listed buildings weren't in that, but obviously until government has responded, we can't say for definite that they're kind of they are exempt or not exempt. So it's a case of watch this space, I'm afraid. I think on that one.
Yeah.
Unless Catherine wants to add more.
Catherine, did you want to come in on that one at all?
No, just to say, there was a number of exemptions that has been consulted on. Probably repeating what Nick's just said, but yeah, they'll be set out sort of in terms of what the final exemption list is. Yeah, soon hopefully.
Brilliant, lovely. So I'm just we've got the 10% there. I'm just flicking through. So I think a lot of these have been answered. I'm just double checking if there were any that we've missed, and any to particularly flag. Yeah, just a question actually again for Councillor Alvey around elms and how that might interact with biodiversity net gain. I don't know if you've got that one covered.
We haven't thought of it with necessarily within the context of elms. However, we are recognising that some of that biodiversity net gain off-site may well link up with our farming community. Obviously, we're waiting for the national scheme to be introduced, but certainly locally, that would be something that we would consider as I say. With off-site contributions, we initially hope the developer will do something locally, but we do have our own local scheme, and for example, that may contribute to our Forest for Cornwall project, which is working certainly on part of our county farms estate.
Becky,
thank you very much. Yeah, come in.
Add something onto that as well, in addition to what the Councillor Alvey said. So people may come across questions from local landowners in relation to, well, how can net gain work in relation to schemes like ELM, or equally, if you've got issues around nutrients, how does it work in relation to nutrient neutrality or the sale of carbon credits, etc., from the land? Understandable, a lot of landowner interest in wanting to know the detail of this. We are expecting some guidance to come out from DEFRA fairly soon about this as well, which should be quite helpful in terms of kind of setting out the relationship between net gain and some of these other schemes as well. So if you are getting questions about that from local landowners, there will be something coming out fairly soon, which hopefully should go a long way to addressing those questions.
Lovely, thanks very much. And just to say, I've just launched a poll. If you're able to give feedback, that would be really helpful, because it just helps us evaluate and sort of also say that we should carry on doing the project if you give good feedback. Obviously not if we don't. So I'm just double checking what we've got on the so we've just got a question around linking local nature recovery strategies into local plan policy and sort of issues, I guess, in terms of not knowing what's happening with the LNRS. at the moment, because we haven't sort of got the regulations out for those. Krista, I mean, obviously this isn't your sort of policy lead, but obviously you're working on the nature recovery side, and we have been doing some thinking about how that links into strategy and policy. Did you want to come in quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's you know, it's a question that has been raised as part of some of the work that we've been engaging with local authorities on nature recovery, and obviously I think the response in the chat was that we got further regs and guidance, but at the moment, yeah, not entirely sure in terms of what level and how much will be covered in terms of the detail for planning policies, but it is definitely a key question, and DEFRA are going to be providing support for responsible authorities on delivering the local nature recovery strategies. They will be setting up a practitioners network and also providing a portal in terms of resources and guidance. But again, obviously some of the things that when we've been speaking to authorities about is, well, actually the non-responsible authorities, you know, how are they going to go about supporting that? And also in terms of how, yeah, particularly in terms of planning policy, how is that reference, and it is referenced into the Environment Act around the regs and guidance. So again, we're waiting further guidance on that. But there are, you know, some local recent, you know, kind of adopted plans that do refer to nature recovery networks and other kind of wider policies and mapping that they're doing around that. So there are examples. Doncaster is one that was recently adopted that do refer to nature recovery networks. And again, in terms of Cornwall's, they do refer to their nature recovery networks. And again, the NPPF also refers to, you know, kind of biodiversity plans and other plans that are helping to restore and recover nature. So again, there's relevant hooks there in the NPPF in the absence of LNRS at the moment and the regs and guidance.
Brilliant, thanks, Krista. And I've just shared a link to our webpage that's got some of those examples on there. So I'm aware of time, and as ever, we've had lots of questions and lots of really useful stuff, and we've run out of time. We will be sharing the questions and answers after today, and obviously any that we haven't got to already, we will endeavour to answer, and then we'll also put those into the add them onto our website as well where relevant. Yeah, just mainly just to thank Councillor Martin Alvey and Councillor Mike McCusker. Really appreciate your time, and it's really, really great to hear all the excellent stuff you're doing. Really, it makes me feel really positive about what's going on. So yeah, do let us know if you've got any sort of specific feedback on this and what you would like to see from the project. I hope that's been useful. And yeah, we'll let you know once the recording is up on the web, and also let you have those questions and answers as well. So